Hi, it's Seb, coming to you from my parents' house in London. I noticed lately a few booktube videos all about Frankenstein, Guillermo del Toro's new Frankenstein movie, and I thought I'll join the fray. I've never really properly done a movie review kind of thing on this channel before, so I'll try and structure my thoughts based on what was kept and what was altered and what was lost from the original book by Mary Shelley. When it comes to this book, I think what people tend to remember and talk about the most is the characters and the themes and how they sort of interplay, creator and creation and all this. But what really sticks with me and was always stuck with me over the years is the structure of this book, the matryoshka structure. It's one Russian doll inside another Russian doll inside a bigger Russian doll. I don't think I found it really anywhere else quite like this in literature. And I don't just mean like a framing device, because you can't really be a gothic novel worth your salt without some kind of framing device, I think, right? We've all read framing devices, but this is really special. I think it's rare where you find a book where it doesn't feel so much like a frame for the main story, but it just feels like layers of an onion in a way. Like each one is important and really fun to read. It has its own weight and they all kind of play off each other very nicely. And it's not like, there's like a very thin outside and then everything is one big chunk in the middle. Because of the three layers in this, we go from the story of the stranded ship in the ice, Captain Walton. Then we move into the narrative of Frankenstein, the scientist who makes the monster. And then in the middle, we get the monster's voice himself, right? And then when that finishes, we get back out into the next layer and then out into the outer layer again. So there's this real kind of sense of being sucked into like the deepest part of a story and then slowly going back out again once you get to the edge. It's got a great symmetry to it. And honestly, the only writer that comes to mind that I can compare with this kind of nesting, story nesting, is Ovid and his Metamorphoses. And even then, all the nesting he does is like several times throughout this massive book. We get, again, that kind of zoom in, like of a fiction within a fiction within a fiction, and then slowly going back out again. But Mary Shelley commits to that in a much more impressive way, I think, by having the whole book, based on this nesting structure. Anyway, does the film do it? Not really, although it's quite interesting. It begins with a title saying Prelude. By the way, if it's not obvious, there's going to be spoilers in this video. So, I'm going to talk about the book and I'm going to talk about the movie. So yeah, if you do want to watch the movie or read the book, then do that before watching this, obviously. The prelude is the story of the ship. Then the man, Victor Frankenstein, comes onto the ship and he's being pursued by a monster. And he tells his story about how he came to be here and what's going on. So already the storytelling is quite different because it's not the captain of the ship, transcribing Frankenstein's words for us. It's Frankenstein in his own words, telling his own story about what happened. And then, continuing that theme, the monster comes onto the ship about halfway through the movie and says, "Oh, he's told you his story, has he? Well, now let me tell you my story," which felt like very, very unrealistic dialogue. But then we go into the monster's perspective. And that I felt owed a lot to this book, Rashomon, by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Cinematically, anyways, this was adapted into a very famous movie in the 1950s. And that movie, is very famous for putting forward different characters who tell their own versions of the same story, and the story radically changes depending on which character is telling it, right? Although this is different from that in the sense that, the Frankenstein's monster isn't actually retelling the old story. He's continuing it. It's just from his point of view, right? But anyway, the point is I felt that the structure owed more to the filmic version of Rashomon than it did to the nesting structure of Mary Shelley. So it is novelistic. It's just not really like this novel. Let's talk about that opening for a minute, right? Because I thought it was great. Like the snow, the isolated crew on a boat which is stuck in the ice on their doomed mission, or it feels like it's doomed mission to the North Pole, right? And then an external threat from the kind of snowy wasteland of an unknown creature. I thought this was actually a lot like The Thing, the 1980s version. I feel like Del Toro must have been a little bit influenced by that movie, even though it's quite faithful to the book at this point. But that atmosphere, that dread, that tension, that isolation, it breaks really quickly. Victor Frankenstein appears, he gets taken in by the crew, the monster appears, and we get this Hollywood bam, bam, pow. So I would have preferred something a little bit more delicate, a bit more subtle maybe, but I also kind of accepted when I was watching it. We're going for this Hollywood format where you do the explosions first to grab people's attention, then we go in for a slower paced flashback sequence. And the flashback takes us to the upbringing of Victor Frankenstein, played as a child, and his dad as Charles Dance, who does a great job of being like a mean dad. He's got that face, right? He's got that mean dad face already built in. We've got this like great Gothic mansion. We've got this kind of stern, quite sinister almost father figure, the sickly mother figure, and then the young boy who's doing his best to be trained to be a doctor under his father's tutelage, right? And I don't remember how much of that, narratively speaking, is actually in this book, or how much of that is Guillermo del Toro's imagination, because I think he wrote the script, didn't he? But the point is that Gothic atmosphere is something that you really want in an adaptation of a Gothic novel, and here the movie really delivers. The sets are gorgeous. They're gorgeous throughout the whole movie. The costumes are also gorgeous, and there's also a sort of epic scale, by going back to when he's a child, making this about his upbringing and like about bloodlines and stuff like this. It makes it quite grand, right? And that fits the Gothic scenario. It's very shadowy. There's a dream that the young Frankenstein keeps having about like an angel, like a sort of an angel with a sword, like an angel of death. And I don't remember if that's in this book, but whether it is or it isn't, it feels like very Guillermo del Toro. It feels like his classic kind of strange and creepy stories that he's made, his name on. Also, the overbearing father and the sickly mother feel very Pan's Labyrinth-y, I think. This whole opening section was classic Guillermo del Toro, and is what you want really from a Guillermo del Toro adaptation of Frankenstein. It's what I would have imagined the best possible version of this movie would be. Now let's talk about the characters. So in the book, they're first person accounts, right? So we have a lot of interiority, we have a lot of kind of psychological depth. A movie can't really do that, so they need to change, and they do this, to the movie's credit. Like it swaps that interiority for exteriority and really lets the actors shine. So Oscar Isaac, who in my opinion can do no wrong in any role, is fantastic as this sort of bombastic Doctor Who energy style mad scientist who's really he's like a dandy. He's proud, he's arrogant, he's theatrical. There's like a scene in a dark tower where he's saying the neuron defibrillator will go there and the polarity will flow there, and like he's just throwing his hands around and shouting this scientific gobbledygook about galvanism and all this. And it's great. It's like classic pulpy horror, and which is just engaging to watch. Then there's the monster, who's played by Jacob Elordi, who I don't think I've seen in anything before, but he also does an incredible job at being basically like a dancer. There's so much sensitivity in all of his movements, in the way that like he kind of drags his feet, like he's not used his feet before, but he has a sense of motion, you know what I mean? Not the way that like a toddler walks, really, but kind of a bit more like a zombie in a way, but like at the same time like a dancing zombie. Every part of his body is just like kind of activated by the world around him. There's just so much sensitivity, you feel like, coming from every pore on this guy. Like the two main leads are just magnetic to watch, and I think the best scenes in the whole movie are when they first meet each other, because while the monster is able to do that sort of newborn, overwhelmed but curious motion, and like kind of also trying to latch on to a father figure, basically, like a newborn would, we have Victor Frankenstein, who is both like horrified and impressed by what he's achieved, impressed with himself, and kind of unexpectedly tender. The unexpected part is that Oscar Isaac manages, I think, to portray that the character feels tenderness that he didn't think he would, because he's sort of a father. And that wasn't what he was going for when he thought, I'm going to create a living creature out of dead bits. You know what I mean? Like, he wasn't trying to be a dad. He was trying to be an icon. And like, now that he's in the moment of his success, he's got this unexpected thing of, a living creature that he feels, I think he shows that he feels some sort of affection for. And he shows him to appreciate sunlight, which is an important scene in the movie, I think. And the way the two characters move around each other, the way the two actors sort of like dance around each other and touch each other in these scenes is just really like fun to watch. And it encapsulates some of the most interesting things about the novel, right? Like kind of the repulsion and attraction of the creator and created like relationship, but also of Guillermo del Toro's vision, because he does change the story quite a bit. And I think this is like the overlap. This is the Venn diagram between the Mary Shelley Frankenstein and the Guillermo del Toro Frankenstein. They overlap, and here in the middle is the sweet spot where they overlap really successfully. This lasts up to the point where Frankenstein leads the monster down into this sort of creepy basement sewer-like area and, traps him in chains, in a very sort of like kind of, it's okay, relax, don't worry, you stay here kind of way, which is kind of scary and terrifying because he's just locking somebody up in a basement, right? And that fear, that edge, of what looks like, an abusive parent, is great because it mirrors the abusive parent that he had himself, right? And you see how he's unwittingly kind of become his father in a weird, twisted way. And also, there's that betrayal of the monster who's, seeing him as a father figure. All of that's fantastic. The other character that needs to be mentioned is Mia Goth's version of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is the love interest. In the book, it's Victor Frankenstein's love interest. In the movie, it's his brother's. But he loves her as well. It's more unrequited, right? And then there's a sort of it's implied that she and the monster have a kind of thing going on, a kind of maybe not love but magnetic connection, because they see each other as outsiders and all this shape of water business, which I wasn't interested in at all, to be honest. But Mia Goth herself is great. It was interesting when she started speaking. I've only seen her do American accents before, and when she started speaking in a British accent, I thought, my God, like this is the first Hollywood actress who can do a really impressive British accent. And so I had to look it up. And yeah, she was born in London. Apparently she's a Brazilian Canadian born in London. So that explains why she's able to do that. But anyway, she's more impressive for the way she holds herself and the way she looks with the costumes and the makeup. In a way, it's a shame that really the most striking aspect of the female lead is the clothes that she's wearing and these like kind of funny feather things that she has like as a headpiece. But at least it looks great. And I do think that Mia Goth does the best that she can with the script that is written for her, which isn't great, I think, not just for her character, but maybe for the whole story in general. And while we're talking about how the characters physically look, I will say that the monster, for me personally, looks way too human, way too nice. And, this is connected to what I think kind of brings down the film in general. We see him at the very beginning as well, and he looks quite human and unmonstrous. Like I said, like that moment where you think you're watching The Thing for a moment, where there's all this isolation and fear and threat, it's kind of ended when the monster appears and he's just like a superhero basically, because he looks like a normal person who's just blue with some stitched up bits. He's like tall and blue, and like that's it really. He doesn't look scary. I don't think he would necessarily need to look scary, but there are so many ways that you could make him sympathetic without making him look like kind of just a normal person. Like it's harder to buy the whole outcast thing. For example, there's a scene where some hunters find him and they say, "What's that?" And they shoot him, right? And he gets wounded. But because he's like a superhero in this version, I don't remember if this is like this in the book. I don't think so. But yeah, he can get shot and stabbed and whatever, and like he's fine, which also removes a lot of the tension. I think in this film, but yeah, like I just found it so implausible because he looks so much like just a kind of a weird guy that people would just shoot him. Do you know what I mean? Like he doesn't really look like a monster at all. So the monster has been made much less monstrous, not just in how he looks, but how he acts and what he does. Like he does murder some people in the movie, like he kills 6 people at the beginning, but it's like action movie killing, it's just like henchmen get killed in James Bond movies, right? Like we don't care about the 6 random sailors that get killed, right? In the book, he plans to murder people, right? To get revenge. So it's a totally different dynamic. So the monster's been made less monstrous, and Frankenstein himself has been made much more monstrous, and that actually has the effect of flattening both of the characters, where there's a lot of kind of psychological depth and ambiguity, I think. Maybe a bit of moral grayness in both of their actions in this, which makes them sort of two compelling foils for each other. In the movie, it's very two-dimensional, and it's not even two-dimensional in a way which makes it a fresh take, because I think anybody which is engaged with the Frankenstein myth, which is like kind of deep in popular culture since like the 1950s Hammer horror movie stuff, we know that Frankenstein is a dirtbag and that the monster is a goodie, right? Like that's already kind of cemented, I think, in audiences' minds, So it's nothing refreshing or interesting about that portrayal. In the book, Victor Frankenstein loses so much, and there's an accumulation of his losses, right? Of the people close to him being murdered one by one, right? And his suffering is so great that even if a lot of it is brought upon himself, I do think it's much easier to feel sorry for Frankenstein, even though he's trash. And his emotions, like when it comes to regret and shame and horror and like his obsession with the creature, right? And like his responsibility, his feeling of responsibility over it. Not necessarily responsibility like a parent, but responsibility like I have brought something evil into this world, right? That that all like makes sense as to why he would, abandon his life and just pursue it into the Arctic, which we know from the beginning is what he's ended up doing, right? Whereas the Frankenstein in the movie, he's so self-centered that it didn't seem like it made any sense to me, even when he does lose some things and lose some people at the end, that he would just throw away his life to chase the monster into the Arctic, because he never really cared about the monster, right, in the movie. In this, like, he abandons it, sure, but he's also haunted. There's nothing wrong with that film portrayal of Victor Frankenstein, I think. It's just that he's so, the parts of his personality which are highlighted, the self-interestedness, the callousness, right, to the point that he doesn't even seem to care about his love interests, Elizabeth, let alone the monster. It just made it hard to believe that he would care about anything outside of himself, which is fine. It just doesn't fit the plot of the movie. And that mismatch between the plot and the characters doesn't end there. And I do think it's all the more striking because they do change the plot quite a lot. And in my opinion, all the changes that they make don't make the story any better. They just make it a little bit more filmy, a bit more Hollywoodish, a bit more predictable and familiar. For example, something which I think is like almost fatally missing from this movie is Paradise Lost by John Milton. Paradise Lost is actually lost because this is one of the first books that the monster reads. And we do in the movie see when he's being taught to read by the old blind man, Paradise Lost is one of the books in his education. But that's about it. And I think that this was so important for the original story of Frankenstein because it begins with Satan being cast out, and Satan is the avenging angel who is outside of, heaven, but trying to build his own heaven and trying to create his place in the world through a campaign of destruction and evil, right? And the monster relates to that. But then at the end of Paradise Lost, the subject of the poem changes from Satan's outcast and revenge against the authority, right? To Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve are also the only humans in the world, but it's a more positive story. It's a positive ending. Even though they get outcast from the garden, just like Satan was cast out, they have hope for the future because they can make more humans, right? And they have love and hope and blah, blah, blah. So the ending is very positive. And in the book, the monster is denied that kind of narrative conclusion. He wants his life to be like Paradise Lost because that's what he read, that's what he relates to, that's how he sees a way out of his situation, right? Like, I can go from Satan to being Adam and Eve. Whereas that overall vision is not in the Guillermo del Toro movie. And so it doesn't make sense to have the lines where the monster says, make me a companion, and Frankenstein says, no, I'm not going to do that. It almost felt like kind of tacked on and unnecessary in that movie. Whereas here, when he gets denied the companion, that's when things get really dark and he goes on his killing spree. And then, we end up in the Arctic. So it creates like a really harrowing finish to the tale. Whereas in Guillermo del Toro's vision, he actually wants to have a more positive ending to the story, and he doesn't want it to end on the monster's terms either, because that would be changing it too much. Instead, we get something which is more like the idea that you can break the chain of the sins of the fathers being passed down, right? Because we saw Frankenstein's father being a crap dad to Frankenstein, and then Frankenstein being a crap dad to his creation. But at the end of the movie, he forgives him, right? He forgives the monster forgives the dad. They hug, do they? I don't know, it feels like they hug, yay. And then, we get the idea that the monster will live. He will live. He is the one who has broken through the chain of abuse, which is fine, I think. Like, it's not a bad way to adapt the story, in my opinion. It's just, it doesn't work because so many of the things leading there didn't have any tension, didn't have any suspense and power. And it didn't need to be like all tense and horror and freaky stuff, right? It could have just been a straight kind of gothic melodrama, and that would have been fine, I think. But honestly, all the character and plot kind of issues aside, the aesthetic just cannot carry this film, I think. And I talked about the great sets, and they look beautiful and there's so much detail in what has been created, but the camera often rushes through them, I think, to the point that we can't really live in those moments, live in those places, right? They just kind of look nice, and then we move on to another nice looking thing. Add to that, this film has some of the worst CG that I have seen in recent years. The real, like, offenders here are the animals, right? The little Snow White scenes where we get the animals flocking to the monster. We get deers, we get rats, we get wolves, although they're not Snow White wolves. They're like big bad wolves, right? But they all look so fake, especially the wolves. They're just like monster wolves, right? And it doesn't really make sense, I think, in a story which is trying to show, like, the empathy and purity of a newborn life, which is outside of human society, and then to show, some wolves which are just like kind of freaky monster wolves. Like, they were trying to show something about the cruelty of life and stuff like that, but I didn't buy it, especially because they just look so fake, right? Like, the deer scene is bad enough because the deer is, Frankenstein's monster sees the deer looks, he feeds the deer, it's like, oh, nature beautiful, and then the deer gets shot by a hunter and it's like, oh, human bad, right? And that is a scene that I have I don't know, either absorbed through popular culture so many times that it was so dull, that it would have been dull even if the deer had been a real deer. It was not anywhere close to a real deer. Like, and if you think of Guillermo del Toro's early works, like The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, right? Like, things that he made where he did not have the kind of budgets that he had for this film, right? He was not a major Hollywood name, but he used CG in a way which was really captivating and interesting to look at. In The Devil's Backbone, there's a ghost with a head injury, and his body is underwater. So when we see the ghost, there's blood like floating out of his head as though it was underwater, right? And it's just like really strange, but makes sense to the story and the characters, and it's just like captivating to look at as well, in a kind of grotesque way. And then in Pan's Labyrinth, there's like a bug which sees Ophelia reading a fairy tale, and she asks, "Are you a fairy like this?" And she points at a picture of a fairy. So the bug rearranges itself to look like what the book says a fairy should look like, so that she thinks it's a fairy, right? And that moment of transformation is CG, obviously, but it's so fascinating because of what's happening in the world, right? And also it just looks good, right? Like, I don't know, like Guillermo del Toro, I thought, was someone who used CG very, very well up until this movie. Like, up until this movie, I felt that the effects are always something which fits the story and never feel like they're just added in for the sake of it. Whereas here it felt like so lazy, so like someone just said, "I want a deer," press like the deer button on the computer. The whole scene was so derivative and cheap looking that honestly I almost felt offended. So there was nothing strange and there was nothing gripping in this movie for me, unfortunately. It was entertaining. I never felt really bored. I never felt like I wanted to stop watching the movie or anything like that, right? I wanted to see it through to the end to see what would happen. It also pointed out a few things which I think are in the book that I never realized because it's been so long since I read the book. But like, the subtitle is The Modern Prometheus, right? And I guess in my mind I was like, oh yeah, Prometheus is the Titan who created humans. Frankenstein creates the monster. Okay, that's like, he's like the god, the old god. I get it. But in the movie, there's a line, maybe from the book, I'm not sure, where the monster says, "I will be the eagle that eats your liver," which was a kind of a strange line, and it was very arresting, and I love that line. And because it reminded me that Prometheus is punished, right? Like, that's the whole point. He creates humans, and then he's punished for creating humans. It was a bad thing. He has to undergo an agony every single day when an eagle comes and eats up his liver, right? And then it regrows. So it's about the suffering of Prometheus, right? When it says the modern Prometheus, it's the creator who suffers specifically, which I just never put that together in my brain for some reason. So when the movie had that line, it unlocked a bit of brilliance of the original novel, which made me very happy. I think there were another few moments like that. I can't recall them at the moment, but that was also, just a good thing about this movie, that it reminded me or showed me things about the original which I hadn't realized, were that good. Unfortunately, I would say overall, I would not rate this film very highly. I think it suffers from, telling a story which is so like mythic. It's a myth in itself, the Frankenstein myth, right? Just like Prometheus was a myth, I think Frankenstein is a modern myth because of how deeply it's permeated our culture and how often it's retold in various ways, which are just better than what we see here. Like, a movie like this invites comparison, not just with the source material, but with all sorts of other like intertextual things. And when I think of movie adaptations of books which, tell the Frankenstein story, then Jurassic Park is probably, I think, the best one. But recently, like at least best in the way that it deals with the themes of the Frankenstein story in a way which is both entertaining and Hollywood and, fun chases, explosions, just like this one was trying to do, like Del Toro's Frankenstein was trying to do, but in a way which also balances the themes and the kind of the characters really perfectly. And then the more recently Poor Things, right? That also had characters which had such depth, and while following the Frankenstein story, there's a lot of strangeness, and we're not 100% on board with anything that every character is doing at any one time. It's not like goodies and baddies. It's the plumbing of the depths of this story which is so embedded in popular culture, right? And yeah, I just felt that this movie was not doing that very much. It felt more like, and it's sad when you think that this is apparently the film that Guillermo del Toro has been trying to make for years and years and years. And you can see why, because it's a sympathetic monster, right? And his whole thing is about sympathetic monsters. But I think honestly, like his sympathy for his monsters has made his films worse over the years, because they're just clearly kind of ugly goodies at this point. You know what I mean? There is nothing really monstrous about them in the way that there was in his earlier films. But anyway, that's going into maybe a non-Frankenstein territory. So I'll wrap up there. I hope this was kind of interesting for you. I'd love to hear other people's opinions on the movie as well as the book itself or any of the adaptations, and how they stack up to Del Toro's work. Yeah, I'd love to chat about that down in the comments. Otherwise, I will catch you in my next video. Bye.